Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is my Friday reads. What are we, the 20-something 3rd of April? I've completed 3 books. Civilisations, the new book by Laurent Binet. Flea by Dara. And Big Girl, Small Town by Gallen. So I'm going to start with Civilisations. So Laurent Binet has released 2 previous works, HHHH and The Seventh Function of Language, both of which were 5-star reads, both of which got into whatever year's respective top 10 reads of the year. And both involve looking or using elements of history, of real life people. In HHHH it was definitely sort of in the vein of historical fiction, although it was sort of lancing that like a boil, and also particularly academic history. With The Seventh Function of Language, it used real-life characters from 80s France, particularly academia, like Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault, people like this, and increasingly got more and more sort of over the top in terms of their relationships with their rivals, and was very, very funny, but also very smart, very sort of incisive about sort of how symbols function, which is of course the work of Roland Barthes himself. So that used real life historical people, but I wouldn't say that was historical fiction. But both of them were very, very subversive. And so we come to this, his new one called Civilisations, which is a work of counterfactual history. So instead of the Spanish invading and conquering both the Inca and Aztec empires, this reverses it out in that it starts off with a Viking expedition discovering the New World, which we believe to be fact. Only here they did more than just discover the New World, they actually interbred with some of the indigenous natives. So that there was this mix of both blood and genes, but also of certain of mythos and folklore, in that Thor gets absorbed into some of the indigenous mythologies. And that's presented in the style of an Icelandic saga. And the next section is sort of fragments of Christopher Columbus's chronicle on his voyage and settlement of America. Only here he doesn't make it back to report to Ferdinand and Isabella on the riches that Spain could make. He basically, his mission fails, all his crew die, and so that the knowledge is never really transferred back into Europe. And then we come to the major part of the book, which is the last emperor, real-life emperor of the Incas, who was called Atahualpa, something like that. In real life, he and his half-brother were engaged in a civil war for power, which sort of left them exposed when Cortes turned up with his 200 men and basically managed to capture the whole empire. That plus the mythos that you know, they worshipped the sun, and that sort of men of the sun would come and their empire would fall. And you know, the Spanish looked very sort of, you know, otherworldly in their armour and with horses and things like that. That's the real life history. Here, because Columbus never got back to report to you know, that there was no Cortes going over, there were no conquistadors. Instead, as part of the civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother, who lost in the real history, but here he's winning and pushing Atahualpa sort of further and further towards Cuba and Jamaica and Haiti. And what he decides to do is basically to use the wrecks of Columbus's ships, which had just been sort of marooned on the beaches for years, and to basically sail away from his brother to escape. And he lands in Lisbon eventually, and he has 200 men and women with him. And it's obviously you know, sort of an ironic inversion echo of Cortes. And he gradually, through use of military power, but also sort of politicking, he sort of spreads his domain and his empire and conquers Castilian Spain, and then sort of moves into sort of other parts of Europe like the Netherlands and the sort of principalities in Germany. So he's sort of sucked into the whole Protestant versus Catholic sort of wars that were raging on. And it's through his skillful manoeuvring and manipulating, guided by Machiavelli's The Prince, which he has a copy of, that he basically becomes to be the most powerful man in Europe and a sort of sovereign. And the final part, we get Miguel Cervantes, true life author, who was wounded. He thought the Turkish fleets in a naval war in Pareto, something like that. And I didn't actually, apart from the fact that those empires are sort of predicated on the power arrangements inherited by the Incas and then the Aztecs, who also have come over by that stage, I couldn't quite see where the counterfactual history was, because a lot of that seemed to be echoes of reality. But this is the problem with the whole book, that what it is effectively is it's sort of inverting what we know as history, and almost like sort of, and it is very imaginative in sort of how it takes the details of what we know and gives them a different spin. But reading this book and reading every move and every advance, be it military or political and diplomacy, it's like he's drawing a map out in front of you. You know those scenes in films where they have a map and they show people an army advancing along the map. That's how this book reads. It's absolutely lifeless. The beauty of his other two books is they're subversive, but they're funny. There's very little humour in this book at all. I think it may be there. So, for example, the Incas build one of their sort of pyramids or ziggurats in the Louvre, which I think is a sort of a nod to Mitterrand building a glass pyramid in the Louvre to sort of, that was his heritage to France when he was president. And a lot of people complained because you've got this modern glass monolith in a sort of, 16th, 17th century sort of palace, the clash of the two architectures. So I think there may be sort of intellectual jokes in there, but I think you have to be French to get them, and they're not as funny as the jokes in his other two books. So this book just, as I read it and I got through it, and I thought, yeah, this is very clever on sort of, the history of Protestantism and Catholicism and, their clash. But so what? What was his point in providing a counterfactual history? I couldn't see, where that was, what that was purpose for. So just incredibly disappointing. 3 stars. And on to Flea by Evan Dara. So the first thing to say is Evan Dara books are really hard to get hold of. He has a publishing company called Aurora Books. It's not self-publishing, I want to stress that. And because of that, they're really hard to get. And as far as I know, that there are 4 books. So I've read, the first one of his I read is called The Lost Scrapbook, which is a bit of a cult classic and is great and has an environmentalist theme. Then the second one, which is his most recent, which was a provisional biography of Moise Eakins, which got into my top 10 reads of last year, which is written as a stage play and downloadable. It's not even available, as far as I know, in print. It's downloadable from his publishing company's website. But the last 2, which are Flea and The Easy Chain, I've not been able to get hold of at reasonable prices. And Paper Bird, our fellow booktuber, very, very kindly sent me through the post both of them, both the Flea and The Easy Chain. So first of all, I want to say very huge thanks to Paper Bird for doing that. And so this is the 3rd of the 4 books of his I've read, and they're all 3 so far are 5 stars. Evan Dara is a really smart writer. He's a bit William Gaddis like in his use of a lot of sort of snatches of dialogue following on from each other. There's no he said, she said, or the names of the characters other than the 2 main characters in here. But it's perfectly understandable. and perfectly easy to follow. So the book starts off with a sort of a local meeting called by a guy who basically wants to interest his fellow townsfolk in the town of Anderburg, Vermont, in solar energy. He wants to sort of sell them solar energy, and is, you know, giving them all the good reasons why. But only a few people have turned up, and this is the second meeting he's held. And they've printed flyers and stuff, which in themselves use up too much energy and scarce resources. But, you know, I think that's the point. So we start with this sort of town meeting in this sense of community in town, of this town called Anderburg. And then we have a section about its university has had to close because basically it's been found out of sort of fraud by claiming grant funding for courses that it doesn't teach. You know, those departments do not exist, and the whole university has been found out. And gradually you realise that this is a book about decay and decline of a town, and that's why it's called Flea. And that this guy who was doing the solar panels, he and his partner called Carol, they have to ditch that, and they come up with the idea of starting an employment agency because so many people are losing their job as this town declines. And they sort of will offset the costs between both the employer and the employee, and those costs are only payable while the employee they find for the employer is still in work, because contracts here are just so sort of vulnerable to the continual decline in the numbers of people who live in this town. And it's brilliantly observed, and it's not attributed to any one single thing. So the university closure, that was brought upon by itself, by its own reckless actions. There's also a lot of stores are shutting here because they get bought up and bought out by bigger stores, and then those bigger stores are vulnerable to Amazon and online shopping. We get a sort of hint of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan here, where there's an unnamed disease that is spreading throughout citizens, and that panics people. So there's all sorts of reasons as to why these towns are declining. And this is very much, it was written in 2013, I think, or published in 2013. But it's, which I will check actually just to make sure I know what I'm talking about on that. Yeah, 213. But it very much prefigures what Trump inherited in sort of communities that were slowly dying, you know, rust belts. But this isn't an industrial town. This is a commercial, mercantile town. And it's so clever. It's so well done. And then, yeah, I don't want to talk about the ending because it does go off in a slightly different direction. And quite an interesting direction, where one of the other characters called Marcus, who's basically has a nice soft job at a sort of well-to-do house where he's been commissioned to design them a landscape garden, and eventually that job goes as well. But Marcus sees it as an opportunity for gratitude, and he wants to promote the idea of gratitude, and taking the good things from life instead of all this negativity that's happening with the town. And in a way that echoes the start of the book in what the other character was trying to do in the solar panels. Now he wants to sort of market and trade well-being, and he's drawing up a list of sort of lectures and stuff. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in that, which is slightly, although I say it echoes the beginning, it does go off in a really interesting direction, I think, and very well worth exploring. And just to say that the town council here play an interesting role. So to begin with, house prices start falling because so many people are leaving, and they get to negative equity. That's what we call it over here. And the insurance companies of the town who insure against negative equity, there are so many cases of negative equity that the insurers then collapse as well, so that people are just leaving abandoning their homes because they can't pay the mortgage, they can't sell it for any kind of value. So the town council, to stop this sort of sort of fleeing of its citizens, decide that it's going to levy a tax, an evacuation tax, and then gradually they realise that's unenforceable and not going to work anyway. So then they come round to what the position they should have been in, which is to actually offer incentives and inducements. But the problem is, instead of offering it to the people who are already there, they're offering it to former citizens who have fled. If they come back, they'll get this payoff. But again, it's wrongly targeted, because then that just creates sort of hostility in the people who have stayed. There's just so much to admire here. It's such it's such a smart book. It is a piece of literature. It is a work of the imagination. It absolutely leads you to the mindset of how Party of America went for Trump. So 5 stars. And finally, to Big Girl, Small Town by Michelle Gallen. So this starts off really well, and I love the voice in here. It is a big girl in terms of her size, and she's on the socially awkward scale, if not the actual Asperger's autism spectrum. And she works in a fish and chip shop in a town, which I won't try and pronounce, on the border with the Republic of Ireland. And, she is someone who tries to minimise social contact. She doesn't really understand other people's reactions. She has a sort of stock set of phrases that she feels she can sort of ladle into conversations when people start them with her. She has these tics she does to sort of calm herself down. She has lots of sex and drink, but not with any sort of particular pleasure. They're almost like itch scratchers or relieving things. And we get to see the characters of the town through the chip shop. I mean, she has a terrible diet. The thing I think that I was most sort of amazed by in this book is every night, other than Sundays, which the chip shop is closed, every night she takes home fish and chips, fried in batter and fried in oil chips. It's a shocking diet, so it's no wonder that she may have behavioural issues, although it's not linked to the food. But nothing happens in 300 pages. So I enjoyed it for the first 60 pages, but then it doesn't develop at all. And I got very weary of it. I couldn't, either you buy into it, that this is just this is a voice and you will enjoy the voice of 300 pages, or like me, you'll get very weary of it. And I think a lot of the love for this book comes because a lot of people on BookTube seem to have listened to the audiobook of it, which is performed by one of the actresses from Derry Girls. And I think that has, I think if you listen to that rather than read it, then yeah, I think you're much more likely to enjoy it. But reading it in isolation, an audiobook is not an option for me. It just didn't, as I say, it didn't go anywhere, and therefore for me it did not work. So I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. And on to what I'm currently reading. So 1960s avant-garde British author Quin wrote 4 novels. This is the 3rd of them, called Passages. I've just started this. My buddy read with Roxy over at a chaotic bibliophile. We are co-reading Who Was That Man by Neil Bartlett, so I won't talk about that till we finish it. This is a reread for me though, and I've done 2/3 of it, and next week will be the final third. And I haven't started this yet, but it's the Quin is 100 pages, so I imagine I'll finish that tomorrow. So over the weekend I'm going to pick up Will Eaves' The Absent Therapist. I read Will Eaves' Murmur. It's a buddy read with Celia and some other readers I now can't remember. Me and Celia did not enjoy Murmur at all, even though it was prize nominated. So I'm giving Will Eaves another go with this. So that's it. That is my Friday reads. So till next time, thanks very much.